In many places across history, there were days that did not announce themselves with events or changes. They simply arrived, quietly, as they had always done. The people who lived through those days rarely marked them as special because nothing about them felt new. The morning light rose at the same angle it had for decades, casting familiar shadows on the same walls, paths, and fields. These were not the kinds of mornings remembered by historians, but they were the mornings most people actually lived. In one such region, far from the centers of power and far from sudden transformation, daily life followed a pattern so consistent that it felt almost timeless. The land itself encouraged routine. The soil behaved the same way each year, the seasons arrived with dependable patience, and the work required to survive never varied enough to demand innovation. People learned early that repetition was not a flaw in life, it was the structure that made life possible. Generations grew up watching the same motions performed by their elders. Children learned not through instruction, but through observation. They saw how hands moved across tools, how feet followed familiar paths, and how voices spoke the same phrases at the same times of day. These patterns were not questioned because there was no memory of anything else. The idea of change was abstract, almost unnecessary. The day often began before sunrise, not because anyone demanded it, but because it had always been done that way. The body adjusted to the rhythm without conscious effort. Awakening came naturally, as if guided by an internal clock inherited from those who came before. There were no alarms, no urgency, only the quiet understanding that the day would unfold exactly as expected. Work followed predictable lines. Fields were tended in the same sequence they had been for generations. Tools were repaired rather than replaced, not out of resistance to progress, but because repair was familiar and sufficient. The hands performing these tasks often belonged to people who had watched their parents do the same work and whose children would later mirror the same movements. The labor itself did not tell stories, it simply filled the hours. Meals arrived at set moments, not by schedule but by habit. The same foods were prepared using methods refined long ago, not because they were the best possible methods, but because they were known and trusted. The taste of these meals carried memory rather than novelty, and eating was less about enjoyment than about continuity. Conversations were brief and functional. There was little to discuss beyond what was necessary, because little changed from one day to the next. News traveled slowly and rarely affected daily routine. When it did arrive, it was absorbed calmly and folded into life without disruption. The absence of surprise made people patient listeners and quiet speakers. As the sun moved across the sky, shadows shifted in ways everyone recognized. They marked time more reliably than clocks ever could. Each position of light indicated not only the hour, but the next expected action. The day was not divided by choice, but by tradition. When evening came, it did not signal rest immediately. It signaled repetition in a different form. Tasks were completed in the same order, tools returned to the same places, and spaces prepared for the night as they always had been. This process required no discussion or planning. It existed as shared knowledge. Sleep arrived gently, without struggle. Bodies accustomed to routine did not resist rest. There was comfort in knowing that the next day would mirror the one just lived. This predictability removed anxiety because nothing unexpected waited in the morning. Over time, these repeated days formed a life that felt long but not heavy. History would later overlook such existence because it lacked defining moments. But for the people who lived it, this steady rhythm was not emptiness, it was stability. And so the routines continued, passing silently from one generation to the next, unchanged, unquestioned, and largely unnoticed. As days followed days, there was little reason to separate one from another. Memory did not store them individually. Instead, they blended together into long stretches of time that felt continuous rather than divided. This was not because life lacked meaning, but because meaning was not tied to variation, it was tied to endurance. The people living within these routines rarely thought about history. They did not imagine themselves as part of a larger narrative. Their attention remained fixed on immediate tasks and familiar outcomes. Time was not measured in years or decades, but in repeated cycles of planting, working, eating, and resting. These cycles were dependable, and dependability removed the need for reflection. Skills were passed down not through formal teaching, but through presence. A child standing nearby would absorb the sequence of actions without explanation. The order mattered more than understanding. The motions became natural long before their purpose was questioned. In this way, knowledge survived without documentation, stored instead in muscle memory and quiet observation. Mistakes were rare because the work had been refined over generations. Errors had been corrected long ago, and what remained was a process that required no experimentation. People trusted what they had inherited, not out of fear of change, but out of confidence in repetition. That trust allowed life to proceed without tension. Even when weather varied slightly, behavior did not. The response to rain, wind, or heat followed established patterns. There was no improvisation, only adjustment within limits that had already been defined by previous generations. Experience had smoothed out uncertainty. The passage of time was visible in people rather than in routines. Faces aged, voices deepened or softened, but the actions remained the same. An older person performed the same tasks more slowly, a younger person more quickly, but the sequence did not change. In this way, time was acknowledged but not allowed to disrupt structure. Tools carried history within them. They bore marks of repair and reuse, but their purpose remained unchanged. A handle replaced here, a blade sharpened there, not to improve efficiency, but to maintain continuity. Each repair extended not just the tool's life, but the routine itself. The environment adapted to repetition as well. Paths became smoother where feet passed daily, surfaces wore down in predictable patterns, even buildings reflected habit rather than design, shaped by use instead of intention. These physical traces recorded history without narration. Communication within this way of life was subtle. Most understanding was shared without words. Gestures and timing replaced explanation. This silent agreement reduced conflict and confusion because expectations were universally known. As night arrived once more, the day ended without summary. There was no need to review what had been done, because it had been done countless times before. The quiet certainty of completion allowed rest to come easily. And so the cycle continued, not because anyone insisted on it, but because it sustained itself through familiarity. Over long periods of time, the absence of change became its own kind of presence. It shaped expectations and influenced how people understood the world. They did not anticipate sudden shifts or dramatic events because nothing in their experience suggested such things were likely. Life taught them consistency rather than surprise. The rhythm of each day softened the sense of urgency. There was no reason to rush because tomorrow promised the same opportunities as today. Progress was measured not by advancement, but by completion. Each finished task simply made room for the next familiar one. This created a steady pace that rarely quickened. Children grew up into adults without noticing a clear transition. Because responsibilities increased gradually, there was no defining moment when life changed direction. The work they performed at adulthood closely resembled what they had practiced since youth. The difference was subtle, marked only by confidence rather than novelty.
Elders held respect not because they possessed rare knowledge, but because they represented continuity. They had performed the same routines longer than anyone else. Their presence reassured others that life could persist without disruption. Aging itself became proof of stability. Seasons passed with minimal emotional response. Spring was expected, summer was accepted, autumn and winter arrived as naturally as breathing. Each season brought adjustments, but never reinvention. These changes existed within a framework that had remained intact for generations. Even celebrations followed predictable forms. They occurred at the same times, used the same gestures, and involved the same expressions. There was comfort in knowing how each gathering would unfold. Surprise was not required for satisfaction. Familiarity was enough. Illness and loss were handled with the